Hey, good morning. I've been reading your comments and you want more information about Louisiana's magnificent history, specifically our food and culture. But before we do that, we have to discuss the one event that started it all, because without it, we wouldn't have Louisiana or America as we know it today. I'm talking about the Haitian Revolution. It was the largest and most successful slave revolt in the Western Hemisphere. So let's talk about it. But first, we've got to set the stage. Some would say our story picks up on December 5th, 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and landed on an island he thought was India. But that's a very Eurocentric way of looking at things, telling the story of a foreign land starting with its colonizers while completely ignoring the native inhabitants. So let's talk about the native inhabitants of Haiti. Who are they? Where'd they come from? And what did they call the island before Europeans renamed it? So, who were the native inhabitants of Haiti? The Taino and the Arawak. Not only are they the native inhabitants of Haiti, but also of Cuba, Jamaica, the Bahamas, the Lesser Antilles, and Puerto Rico. Their territory encompassed the entire Caribbean and then some. They were the first people Columbus encountered when he discovered America, and they had various names for their island home. One being Quisqueya, the other Bohio, and another was Haiti. But Columbus didn't care about any of that. He was European. As soon as this musty Italian stepped foot on the Taínos' territory, he claimed it for the Spanish royal crown and renamed it La Isla Española. Later became Hispaniola. This evil bastard described them as handsome and naked and was mad that he only saw one little girl. He stole 7 natives to take back to Spain with him and wrote to the King of Spain saying with 50 men we could enslave them all. From 1492 to 1513, that's exactly what they did. By simply existing within native territories, these filthy Europeans with their diseases wiped out about 95% of the native inhabitants. That's about 8 million people. Now, some of the Taino were able to survive by escaping and setting up camp elsewhere. Then European interest in Hispaniola began to falter after they discovered gold in Mexico and South America. After that, the Spanish was like, well, we might as well just stay, and set up a settlement in Yaguna. Skipping ahead to 1543 when French pirates burned their settlement to the ground. In 1592, the English showed up and burned what they rebuilt. In 1595, the Spanish and Dutch were beefing with each other, so they cut off all ports to the Dutch. Then in 1605, the Spanish caught wind of some illegal trading going on with the Dutch, and they got so pissed off that they burnt the whole settlement to the ground. Doing that only made it easier for French, English, and Dutch pirates to take over. Then in 1697, the French took over and they brought in enslaved Africans to work in their fields. In 1697, after decades of war, the Spanish seceded the western half of the island to the French. The French called their portion of the island Saint-Domingue. I hope I'm saying that right. And Saint-Domingue was making sweet, sweet money for the French government. And I mean that literally. It were sugar plantations. Hard, labor-intensive sugar plantations that the French were not working. They enslaved Africans and brought them to the island to work for them. While the French side of the island was making that sweet, sweet money, the Spanish side fell into disrepair. Then Mother Nature stepped in and sent hurricanes and earthquakes, and both populations began to dwindle. In 1711, Louis XIV officially made Cap Français the capital instead of Port-au-Pays. In 1726, the city of Les Cayes was founded and became the largest settlement in the South. In 1749, we got Port-au-Prince. In 1770, Port-au-Prince was hit with an earthquake and tsunami that killed 30,000 with famine and disease. From 1756 to 1763, before the 7 Years' War, the economy of Saint-Domingue went through a bit of a growth spurt. They started out by enslaving Africans and forcing them to grow sugar. Then they expanded into coffee. After the war, their economy blew all the way up. In 1767, they exported 72 million pounds of raw sugar and 51 million pounds of refined sugar, exported 1 million pounds of indigo, and 2 million pounds of cotton. Man, they was making so much money they called that area the Pearl of the Antilles. It was the richest colony by the 18th century. By the 1780s, they produced 40% of all sugar and 60% of all coffee consumed by Europeans. This single colony, no bigger than Hawaii or Belgium, produced more sugar and coffee than all of Britain's West Indian colonies combined. By the end of the 1780s, a third of all Africans in the Atlantic slave trade ended up in Haiti. By the end of the 1780s, 1/3 of the entire Atlantic slave trade ended up in Haiti. Roughly 12 million Africans were taken from their homes, enslaved, and brought to both the New and Old World. And 1/3 of them ended up in Haiti. How was this small French colony able to hold so many enslaved Africans? It's because of death, destruction, and the degradation of black bodies. You see, the French had enslavement down to a science. They knew that if you survived the Middle Passage, once you stepped foot on the shores of Haiti, you had 3 years to live. The French would literally work the enslaved to death. That's not an exaggeration. That's fact. Those who refused to work in the fields had their brains blown out on the spot. And the French colonists just waited on the next shipment of enslaved Africans to replace you. And those who did work the fields endured a torture like no other. To work in the sugarcane fields is absolute torture. Under the right conditions, the plant itself gets anywhere between 8 to 15 feet tall, and the leaves are serrated. They're like tiny knives that cut you as you move through the plant. In most cases, you don't even realize you've been cut until your sweat falls into the wound and it begins to sting. It's like being cut with tiny knives from the top of your head on down. And at the root of the plant are ant colonies that bite you from your feet on up. If you refused to work, you were killed. And if you didn't work fast enough, you were beaten. Remember, the French had enslavement down to a science. They knew that giving you 50 lashes in about 5 minutes, it caused pain, but it wasn't enough to make a lasting impression. So what they decided to do is give you 25 lashes over the course of half an hour. Afterwards, your body was dusted in hot peppers and salt. To add insult to injury, this was done in front of the entire community while you were completely naked. For the French, it was cheaper to kill an enslaved African and wait on a new shipment to arrive than to improve their living conditions. And over the course of 100 years, from 1680s to the 1780s, over 1 million Africans were killed. Y'all don't hear me. They killed over 1 million people in the course of 100 years. Now remember, slavery started in Haiti in 1492. And at that time, Columbus and them killed over 8 million indigenous people. The death rate in Domingue was ridiculous. Listen to me. In just 100 years, enslavement killed 1 million people, and thousands more were killed by suicide because they knew death was better than enslavement. And women. Newly arrived African women committed suicide at a higher rate than anybody else. Not only were they forced to work in the fields, but they were also subjected to rape. Their bodies were no longer their own. They were reduced to little more than a substitute for some white man's hand. And those who were impregnated often didn't make it to full term. They either died during pregnancy, during birth, or they didn't deliver live births. My God, this is what the French did to African people. This just didn't happen in Haiti, but in every French colony around the world. That is their legacy. The legacy of the French. Their pastries and desserts that we love so much are a result of the enslavement of African people. Lord have mercy. Now, food insecurity was a big problem in the Haitian colony. Unlike the Americans who purposefully starved Native American children by giving them the absolute minimum amount of food to eat in order to figure out what the human body needed to survive, which is how we ended up with nutrition facts today. The French didn't care if they ate or not. If you wanted food and you were hungry, you needed to grow it yourself, but you did it on your own time after you finished their 12 to 14-hour workday. And don't forget, it was completely legal to kill any enslaved African who disagreed with a white person, talked back to a white person, or hit a white person. Check out the 1685 Code Noirs for more information on that. That was instituted in every French colony, including Louisiana. Now, the legal killing and torture of enslaved Africans were routine for the French. It was almost fun for them. They were whipped, burned alive, restrained, and allowed to be eaten by swarms of insects. They were mutilated, raped, they had their limbs cut off. And if you were caught eating sugarcane, they forced you to wear a muzzle in the fields. And on top of all that, the Catholic Church condoned slavery and agreed with the French's mistreatment of African peoples, saying that slavery was the only way you could convert an African to Christianity. In Saint-Domingue, about 48,000 Africans escaped enslavement. Now, those who weren't caught and re-enslaved established communities outside of already settled areas. They became known as Maroons, and these Maroons would organize raids on plantations, stealing food, weapons, and supplies needed for their survival. And the most famous of the Maroons was Francois Mackendal. He escaped to the mountains and helped to organize these raids on plantations. But in 1758, he was captured and burned alive at the stake, because that's what white people do. Thankfully, his legend lives on. It inspired fear in the slaveholders and a spirit of revolution in the enslaved. Now, those who didn't escape enslavement fought back in various ways. They poisoned their enslavers, poisoned their livestock, their families, even other enslaved Africans. Poisoning became such a frequent occurrence that the King of France actually banned the use of poison. Also, arson was a favorite tactic of resistance.